I've seen an interesting phenomenon when discussing tabletop games online, and even heard it in my friends group a few times, and that is that many wargamers can't get into card games because card games are too difficult. And I thought that was an interesting statement and one worthy of discussion on this channel of all places. Now, I tend to dabble in all things tabletop gaming. I'm pretty avid in both miniatures gaming and TCGs. I've got a respectable pile of miniatures and cards alike. Between Lorcana and Flesh and Blood, I probably have a few thousand cards alone, to say nothing of my other cardboard addictions. Likewise, I've got boxes and drawers full of miniatures, and more on the way because self-control is for cowards, and I'm pretty sure I can start storing models in the pantry. So, which is harder, cards or miniatures? And the answer I'm going to give is total bullshit cop-out answer, but it's the truth. It depends on the game. Both fields have their simple and their complex games. And I'm not using simple as a derogatory term, by the way, but basically to mean streamlined. I've played a lot of games in both categories, something nearing 40 or so miniatures games, at least 9 or 10 different TCGs, and a handful of TCG adjacent games like Keyforge and Ashes Reborn. I don't think one is inherently more difficult than the other. But let's compare the two big dogs of their respective fields, Magic the Gathering and Warhammer. I'd say, having played both of these games at some point in my career, that they're pretty equal in terms of complexity. Magic's core rules are pretty straightforward. You win by reducing your opponent to 0 life by attacking with creatures and spells. In Warhammer, you win by, well, whatever the hell the win condition of the mission you're playing is. I'd argue that at the core, Magic is the simpler game. Creatures have 2 stats, power and toughness, whereas a model in Warhammer has something like 6 at the very least. And those stats aren't printed on the model's base, so you have to keep extra stuff handy to remember what they do. Both games can devolve into keyword extravaganzas, and Magic is pretty notorious for some cards being keyword soup, like the Indominus Rex. Warhammer has a similar problem with a ton of keyword special abilities, and while I can't speak to if it's still an issue, I do know that in the past they would often have a different ability name for the same ability based on faction. Magic tends to be good about explaining what ability does on a card, but some cards have so much going on they simply can't, and if you don't remember what they all do, this can lead to issues. Where the complexity comes in is rules interactions. In Magic, all sorts of shit can chain and trigger, and you have to keep track of what is where on the stack. That is to say, if multiple cards have abilities that trigger, you need to remember what order they trigger in because that can drastically change the course of events. Especially in games of Commander, which feature 4 players, things can get out of control very quickly. And there are some decks that live to manipulate the stack and trigger a dozen abilities a turn. Warhammer has some rules interactions that can complicate things, but I don't think quite on the same level. I remember playing Warhammer Fantasy and bringing a magic item, but my opponent had a different magic item that effectively negated my item's benefit and the likes, but it was always fairly simple in comparison. Building for a game is a whole different barrel of screaming monkeys. Deck building in Magic is actually pretty straightforward as far as rules go. 60 card deck can only have so many copies of a card. Bam, done. The complexity comes in knowing how to craft a deck, how many lands you'll need, a creature to non-creature ratio, and so on. It can get very complex when you start breaking it down to mana production versus average cost of a card, or start getting the shit like fetch lands and whatever the fuck wild mechanics they've added in the recent years. I mean, dungeons? That's a thing. Warhammer has changed a lot over the years with how one builds an army. It also varies depending on which Warhammer you're playing, 40k or fantasy. I don't even begin to know how army construction works in Age of Sigmar. In 40k, you had a force organization chart that said you must take X units and then choose Y units. It was pretty straightforward and standard across all armies. Every army had to take an HQ and 2 troop choices as their bare minimum. Now it's got this whole thing with detachments, which determine what units you can take and special rules, and I have no idea how the fuck it actually works, even after reading through the article about it on the Warhammer community site. In fantasy, and I believe it's this way in the old world, you had to take a certain percentage of your points in core unit choices, and then could take X percentage in characters and Y percentage in rare units and like. It could get pretty complicated sometimes, especially if you're like me and Numbers of the Devil. But these also aren't the only two games in town. Battletech on the miniature side is known for crazy dense and crunchy rules with tracking heat and ammunition and armor and internal damage to your mechs and vehicles and so on. But the force construction is super easy. Pick a points level and go. The world of Battletech is pretty open to letting you take whatever the hell you want and just having a good time, within reason. Something like Lorcana is pretty straightforward rules-wise, and deck building is similar to Magic. 60 cards, no more than 4 copies of any single card. Other games like Flesh and Blood can complicate deck building a little, as many cards come in 3 versions, and you can have up to 4 of each of those versions in a deck, meaning you can run a dozen of a single card. And you get into the nitty-gritty of resource versus output pretty quickly in that game. Keyforge is a crazy easy card game, and a fucking blast, with pre-made decks. Ashes Reborn, also a blast, is considerably more complex with its turn structure and use of dice as resources. Miniatures games like one-page rules are all about keeping it simple and straightforward. Relic Blade is a little more complex, but not by a whole ton, which is a good thing. Compare those to something like the Old World, and the former are way easier to navigate. Look at something like Infinity. That game has layers of special rules, and you have to remember what they all do and how they interact with each other. That game is insane in that regard. And really, have you all even looked at Malifaux? Tell me that game is easier to figure out than fucking Lorcana. I dare you. And there really isn't a clear-cut answer here. Both genres have their easier to grasp games and their complex games. And that's okay. That's good even. I can understand why someone who has never played a TCG could see them as complex. Sometimes they can be, and if you just dive in and watch modern top-tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks in action, you'll be at a total loss. Likewise, if you jump in blind and watch a video of someone playing Battletech, you'll likely think that those people are mad. I encourage people to try new things and to play different types of games. I love all games, and they all serve a purpose. But no one is inherently more difficult or complex than the other, especially because everyone's brains are wired differently. One person may be able to grasp the minutiae of tactical positioning and setting up fire lanes and be totally flabbergasted by the idea of lands and mana. Likewise, someone might be able to build the best deck in the world in their TCG of choice and make it a fine-tuned machine of destruction, but the moment dice are involved, their brain breaks. And that's okay. Not everyone can be a perfect gaming being like myself, capable of understanding all things as long as they don't involve anything even resembling complex arithmetic.